free-to-play game, which was a multiplayer MMO, so there's a lot of sort of server traffic that generates. One of the big problems that we had with it is that it was a 600 megabyte client initially, so it's free to play but with a download which would take a very long time. And trying to distribute it, I mean, you talk about NG Moco, they're sort of, they have a distribution model, you know, which puts their free games in the hands of everyone sort of straight away. And we really sort of struggled to get the game sort of downloaded onto people's PCs. And eventually we cracked that one, I use the word cracked, by basically distributing via torrents and calling Football Superstars a kind of a cracked version. And suddenly it flew off the shelves, as it were.
It was free anyway.
It suddenly it's free anyway, but suddenly people perceived this value that they were kind of ripping us off by downloading it. So that worked very well.
Trials HD did the same, by the way. They distributed their own cracked version of it as a marketing tool. You couldn't join the leaderboards. So they knew it was going to go.
So stolen is the new marketing technique.
Well, that was what they did. I'm not necessarily sure I'd recommend that one, but that's what they did.
Yeah. Sorry, I'll just add with regards to the dangers of free as a marketing tool. The angle that we're taking with the Facebook game that we're about to launch is we're actually having a 3D browser-based sort of multiplayer environment. And again, as I said, server traffic is very high, and that costs money to run. And obviously, we want that to be scalable, so we're going with Amazon Web Services, so they've got a sort of scalable server setup. If people go in there and they're playing a free-to-play game, and they're spending quite a bit of time in that environment, before we actually get to the point where we monetize players, if we have the kind of success that you see with something like Farmville, then that will just make us the most bankrupt development studio of all time, because it would just we'd be hemorrhaging cash up front before we'd actually got to the point where we're monetizing players. So we have to, we're obsessively sort of making sure that we can find ways of sort of rationing how much access people have to that sort of traffic-intensive, server-intensive environment, and making sure that we kind of gate access to the game in the first place, so that we can grow steadily without sort of hemorrhaging cash. So I do think that free is, you know, there are dangers associated with it. It's very easy to talk about free when, you know, you have a very low traffic Flash game. But as soon as you sort of start to introduce more complex gaming, then you end up with more complex challenges.
So surely the issue is there that free is a very powerful marketing technique.
Yeah.
You know, it is opening up an enormous audience,
yes,
and it's potentially one that is just going to exclude lots of types of games, lots of game developers, lots of genres.
Yes.
You know, it's definitely a problem for the consoles. If you look at the handheld market, for example, right now, you know, clearly the iPod market is doing damage to PSP and DSi, or the DS. Yeah. And you've got to sit there and wonder how much perhaps we're being left behind if you aren't able to play in that space. Yeah. But you're right, you know, you can't go there with certain types of games.
Isn't free, though, something that's been around for a long time? I think back to the shareware days when I was at university a long time ago. I played Doom. I know hopefully a lot of people here probably did, and they gave away a third of the game for free, and you could play the entire first, you know, series or chapter, episode, whatever it was. You know, and it was a third of the entire game, really huge chunk of the game, and then, you know, and it did incredibly well. And I just think that free doesn't have to mean the, you know, I think there are lots of different ways of doing free, and I think, you know, to focus on just one particular model isn't necessarily the right route for even for shooters and things like that. I think there are ways of just getting people to play your game, to really fall in love with it, to realise how great it is, and then to get them to pay some money. So I don't know. I think it's worth thinking about all of the different ways that free can work.
Okay. At the risk of drifting over into a more marketing question, for those of you who, I think two of the panel weren't here this morning, Charles was talking very coherently about the need for a marketing plan, building launch awareness, not wasting any of your PR opportunities to drive kind of early sales. But I'm hearing some responses here that suits some business models but not others. Does that make sense with what you guys are saying? Does that ring true?
I think growing cautiously is necessary in certain, you know, circumstances. Yeah, for sure.
But Ian, in your world, would you be kind of backing Charles's launch strategy, or have you played more with kind of launch
I
over
think
time?
for us, where we've been successful, it's where we've been able to take a very long-term view of the product, because it's our product, and we've been able to start the marketing very early on in development, start engaging with the people we think are going to be the community very early on. And actually one of the problems I have with Ben's talk about the fact that on XBLA you've got to go through a publisher of some kind, whether that's MGS or a third party, is actually as a developer producing your own product, as I said earlier, you really have to get into the mindset of being a publisher. And that means the key is how are you going to reach your audience, how are you going to engage that audience for the whole life cycle. And actually I think the big launch thing doesn't work as well for digital as it does for retail goods. And actually what you really want to be looking to do is how to keep that audience, you know, going long, long after you first launch the product. I think with Burn Zombie Burn, James's team at Double Six have done a tremendous job of coming up with all kinds of ways, from competitions, DLC, strategies, all sorts of niche marketing techniques, such that game is still now selling the same number per week as it was a month after it first launched, a year ago now. So we're managing to keep that game in the audience's mind and continue to sell the game through all of these ways of looking at the sort of marketing of the product. From long before it launched, now a year after it's launched, we still have a regular ongoing discussion about marketing it.
Is the current indie set up to do that though, in terms of the actual size and the management that's involved? Because, yeah, I mean, Kuju, we've all got the perception of brand awareness and the size of the company, but surely keeping something going for that long takes a lot of effort. And obviously, as we know, as being independent, you've got to manage the time, you've got to manage the work for hire projects to reinvest that working capital and all the buzzwords to keep everything else going. So is it actually feasible?
Yes. Just before you answer for a second, just because we're streaming, I'll repeat the question, not the full version. But is it feasible for an indie to continue developing for a year or more on a project while continuing to manage work for hire and everything else? A live project.
I think it's a change of mentality, really, isn't it? I mean, it's a shift from a product mentality where we stick something in a box and we give it to the publisher and say goodbye and fingers crossed and hope for the best, to one that says, actually, we're going to make this game. Yeah, I was brought up, I think, in Jefferson's talk, from Playfish earlier on today. Launch is just the start. And that is a significant shift in thinking. I don't think size or scale really kind of comes into it. I think ultimately you've got to then budget for that product over a much longer period of time, that it then becomes a service. And that can involve obviously increased server costs and everything else that's there. So it's got to be a scalable model as well, dependent on the success of that. We talked earlier that it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. You've got to have, you've got to go the distance.
I go one stage further than that, actually. I mean, I think if you talk about indie games development as being sort of small, then actually in the digital space, you've got an advantage over the big players, because you better understand your product than perhaps a big publisher does. You're better able to talk to your players than perhaps a big publisher is. And actually, although when EA decide everything's digital, they're going to have